So we've been trying to understand the American experience in the 1920s in this module. A couple of things that we have seen is that what's taking place in the United States is different than what's taking place around the rest of the world. You have to picture a Europe after World War I that's been torn apart by countries being at each other's throats and killing one another for 4 long years. You then move to the United States and you have a place that went unscathed in this battle. Yes, there were Americans who died fighting in World War I, but the question for Americans in the 20th century is, what do we amount to? Do we amount to this Arcadian, innocent place that forever can be the world as it ought to be? So we see a picture of that drawn in Coolidge's Arcadia in Vermont. We see a picture of that drawn in Hoover's call for an individualism tempered by equality of opportunity. But then we have to ask the question, is the American experience in the 20th century truly an Arcadian experience, or is it a transient experience in which we have a roar, but that roar comes to an end? And why does that roar come to an end? Which is why I want to finish our coverage of this century by turning to the novel that tried to be the defining novel of this century, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Throughout this course, you're going to see me have you read great, defining, decade-long novels. In fact, where we go after this is to The Grapes of Wrath. What does this novel do, and what does it say to us about the American experience? Well, I think most literary critics who take a look at F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby say what Fitzgerald understood, right, was that there was this outward-facing America that was successful, that thought itself Arcadian, that thought itself great. But then there's this inner reality that America was not so great. So oftentimes the literary critic looks at Fitzgerald and says, see, Fitzgerald points out all the imperfections of America and doesn't really appreciate America as the land of hope. And I would counter that to some degree. I think there is definitely truth in that assessment of Gatsby as a novel and what Fitzgerald is trying to show, kind of inwardness and otherworldliness, etc. But I think there's also an embrace of America at its best. And I want to point out at the beginning of my coverage of the novel 2 places where you see this embrace of America and what America amounts to. And I think it's, in particular, it's moving. It should be moving to us because maybe there's something here in Fitzgerald's positive assessment of the country that might be recaptured to make us better even in our own day. So here the narrator of the story, Nick, at the beginning of the book, page 1, chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Quote, whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. Just remember that when you want to criticize someone. Well, Nick will go on to say that reserving judgment, right, has become the way that I've tried to operate, and I try to reserve my judgment on people because I try to remain a person of hope. Now, that's difficult in certain times, in certain places, and especially when you're around certain personalities to reserve your judgment. But Nick suggests that you're doing your best when you're reserving your judgment. Now, what does that mean for us? We know what the word prejudice means. It's to prejudge someone. It's to judge a book by its cover. It's to judge a person by the clothes they wear or this or that. And what Nick is saying is that if you do that to the nth degree, what you will not grant the other is the opportunity to show themselves worthy of your attention, right, and worthy of your acceptance. So an America at her best is an America that reserves judgment, that allows people from all different places to come here and the opportunity to enjoy the American way of life. So then on the next page, and this is very, very interesting, after referencing the importance of hope and saying, right, that reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope, he then says the following. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has its limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care where it's founded on. When I come back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in a uniform and a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. And then he says the following: my time in Long Island, only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, about Gatsby, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. The responsiveness had nothing to do with the flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. What did Gatsby have? What did Gatsby possess? An extraordinary gift for hope. You see, what's driving Gatsby, who wants to be loved by others, who wants to have a house that everyone sees, who wants to light up that house with electricity and bring into his house all of the famous and wealthy, what drives Gatsby is a hope that he can make himself better than where he came from. And I think that that's an interesting assessment, right, of what drives the American experience at the forefront. If reserving judgment is a matter of hope, if actually having aspiration is a matter of hope, then where America is at its best is where we allow for those aspirations and we reserve judgment so that those aspirations can find fruit. Now, certainly we see, as we read in this novel, that this dream that Gatsby had of himself was what? Was undone. But he wasn't wrong for having the dream in the first place. He became wrong when the dream amounted to impressing others more than doing the virtuous work that would allow him to be successful in the first place. An inner-directed aspiration for success is what drives America at its best. An other-directed, wanting everyone to like you and enjoy you and celebrate you, is a way of approaching the world that will lead to your ultimate demise. So let's take that idea or that concept that's particular to Gatsby and let's apply it to the 1920s. We know from reading Maclay and Paul Johnson and other historians that the 20s were roaring. We know that people were able to purchase cars and houses and all the rest, that there was an allowance and enabling for people to do things that they'd never done before. And to want to enjoy the fruits of their labor is not a bad thing. To want there to be an Arcadian experience is not a bad thing. But what happens when life becomes simply achieving success so that you can show that success to others and gain the applaud of others? If that is the way that life is lived, then you run the danger of, when you fail, not having the applause of others and having, instead of their clapping for you and enjoying, they're pointing a finger at you and showing you what? Showing you that you never could have made it in the first place. That lack of a reserve of judgment in that case. So I think what Fitzgerald is after here is the hope that we can have an inner-directed desire for success, but that kind of hope being corrupted by the outer world and another directedness that led us. So something to think about as we move to the 1930s and what we see around us, which will be depression, which will be, instead of success, a good part of failure and poverty and starvation and all the other things that will define our experience. Can we still recapture that drive that we see in the 1920s? That remains to be seen.